October 31st, 2018 was supposed to be just another typical Halloween for Chris and his group of friends. They were too old for trick-or-treating, but too young for serious parties. So they did what they always did: wander around the neighborhood, pulling pranks, eating candy, and daring each other to explore the more mysterious parts of town. Chris had heard the rumors about the old house on Elmwood Street for years. The locals called it the widow's house, though no one seemed to remember who the widow was or how the story started. The only thing people knew was that the house had been abandoned for decades. It sat at the end of a long, winding road, hidden behind tall trees, its windows dark, the paint peeling off its walls. The town's teenagers had dared each other to break into the house for as long as Chris could remember. But few ever went past the front gate. That Halloween night in 2018, the weather was unusually warm for late October. There was no wind, no rustling of leaves, and the sky was clear, giving the neighborhood an eerie stillness. Chris and his friends Mason, Riley, and Luca had grown bored of the usual Halloween antics. Mason, always the bold one, was the first to suggest it. "Let's finally do it," he said, tossing a half-empty candy bag to the side. "Let's go to the widow's house." Chris felt a twinge of unease, but didn't want to seem scared in front of his friends. Riley was already hyping it up, and Luke, the quiet one of the group, just nodded. "Fine," Chris muttered. They walked, the more the houses thinned out, until only the looming silhouette of the widow's house remained ahead of them. As they approached the rusted iron gate, Luke, who had brought a flashlight, hesitated. "You guys sure about this? I heard someone tried to break in last year and disappeared." Mason scoffed, pushing the gate open. "That's just a story to scare people off. Don't be such a wuss." They stepped through the gate, the creaking of metal echoing unnaturally loud in the quiet night. The air around them seemed to change the moment they crossed into the yard, colder, thicker, like it was weighing them down. The house stood before them like a giant, its windows dark and its front door slightly ajar, swaying in the breeze that wasn't there. "Who leaves their door open?" Riley joked, trying to shake off the tension. But no one laughed. As they entered the house, Chris immediately regretted coming. The inside was worse than the outside: furniture covered in thick dust, cobwebs draping the corners of the ceiling, and an overpowering smell of rot. It was like the house had been frozen in time, abandoned without warning. "Okay, we're in," Chris said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Can we go now?" But Mason was already wandering off, poking through rooms. "Let's see what's upstairs." Chris's stomach churned as he glanced up the staircase. The stairs groaned under Mason's weight as he went up. Riley and Luke followed hesitantly. Chris lingered at the bottom, his gut telling him something was wrong. Upstairs, the air was even colder. Mason was the first to enter the master bedroom at the end of the hall. The door was closed, but when he pushed it open, a gust of icy wind blasted out, despite the windows being firmly shut. In the middle of the room stood an old rocking chair, swaying back and forth slowly as if someone had just been sitting in it. "Mason!" Chris shouted from downstairs, running up the steps. He grabbed the doorknob, but it was ice cold and wouldn't budge. Inside the room, Mason's flashlight flickered, casting long, distorted shadows across the walls. His friends pounded on the door, but it felt like they were miles away. Slowly, he turned toward the rocking chair, heart pounding in his chest. In the dim light, he saw a frail, gaunt woman sitting in the chair. Her eyes were sunken into her skull, skin stretched tight over her bones. She smiled at him, her lips cracked and dry, revealing teeth that were far too sharp. "You came," she rasped, her voice like nails on a chalkboard. "Just like they all do." Mason backed up, his legs shaking. But the room felt smaller now, the walls closing in. The woman rose from the chair, her bony hands reaching for him. He screamed, but his voice was swallowed by the silence of the house. Outside the room, Chris, Riley, and Luke were desperately trying to break the door down. When, suddenly, it swung open on its own. They rushed inside, only to find it empty. The rocking chair had stopped moving. Mason was gone. Panic set in. They searched every inch of the house, calling Mason's name, but there was no trace of him. No sign he had ever been there. "We have to go," Chris said, his voice shaking. "We have to leave now." As they stumbled out of the house and into the night, they realized the temperature had dropped sharply. A thick fog had rolled in, and the once clear sky was now overcast. The street was empty. Not a single trick-or-treater in sight. When they reached the end of Elmwood Street, Chris turned back one last time. Through the fog, he saw her standing on the porch of the widow's house, her hollow eyes staring straight at him. They never found Mason, and Chris, Riley, and Luke never spoke of that night again. But every Halloween since then, Chris swears, he can hear Mason's voice calling for help from inside the widow's house. It was a cold, windy night when Julia, a young nursing student, arrived at the aged Sanborn Hospital for her night shift. The hospital was old, with corridors stretching endlessly, and dim lights flickered at the worst possible moments. Room 204, located in the hospital's west wing, was known for its unusual history. It had been unoccupied for several years, not because it was broken down, but because of the unexplainable events that seemed to occur there. Whispers among the staff said that the room had been closed off after a tragic incident many years ago. A patient named Mrs. Harper, elderly and bedridden, had passed away there, under mysterious circumstances, though her death was ruled as natural. Some of the staff believed there was something more sinister lurking. Those who had been on duty the night she died spoke of hearing faint whispers, cold drafts with no source, and the unsettling feeling of being watched. But Julia didn't believe in ghosts or cursed rooms. She prided herself on her rationality. So when the head nurse asked if she could check room 204 for an issue with the lights, Julia agreed without hesitation. Armed with only her flashlight and a checklist, she walked toward the west wing, the sound of her shoes echoing through the eerily quiet corridor. As Julia approached room 204, she couldn't shake a strange sense of foreboding. The door, slightly ajar, creaked as she pushed it open. The room was still and dim, illuminated only by the moonlight filtering through the half-drawn curtains. Dust particles danced in the air as her flashlight beam cut through the gloom. She scanned the room: an old hospital bed with clean white sheets, a chair by the window, and the usual medical equipment. Everything seemed perfectly normal, yet the air felt heavy, as if the room itself was holding its breath. Julia checked the light switch on the wall. It flicked on and off as expected. "Nothing wrong here," she murmured to herself. Just as she turned to leave, the temperature in the room plummeted. A shiver ran down her spine, and her breath became visible in the frigid air. Her flashlight began to flicker. She slapped it lightly, trying to steady the beam, but it was no use. In the brief moments of darkness, she thought she saw movement in the corner of her eye. She whipped her head around, heart pounding. But there was nothing, just the chair by the window. The flashlight blinked again, plunging the room into darkness. When the light returned, Julia froze. Sitting in the chair was the faint silhouette of an old woman, her form translucent and barely discernible. Her back was hunched, and her head turned slowly to face Julia. The figure's eyes were hollow, black voids, and a cold, malevolent smile crept across her face. Julia stumbled back, her heart racing. "Who are you?" she stammered, but the figure did not respond. Instead, it slowly rose from the chair, the air around it crackling with an unnatural chill. The flashlight blinked again, and when it flickered back on, the figure was gone. Breathing heavily, Julia scrambled to the door, her mind racing. Had she imagined it? Was it some trick of the light? As she reached for the doorknob, a whisper, faint and raspy, filled the room. "Stay with me." She froze, her hand hovering inches from the knob. Her pulse thudded in her ears as she turned back toward the bed. Standing at the foot of it was the figure of Mrs. Harper, her ghostly form more distinct now, the smile still etched on her face. Julia's skin prickled with terror. "I've waited so long," the voice hissed. Suddenly, the door slammed shut with a deafening bang. Julia screamed and lunged for the door, but it wouldn't budge. Her flashlight flickered wildly, casting distorted shadows across the walls. "Help! Somebody help me!" she screamed, banging on the door with all her strength. But no one came. The hospital was silent, as if the entire world had been swallowed by the darkness in room 204. The figure moved closer, its smile widening. Julia's body felt heavy, as though the air itself was pressing down on her, forcing her to the ground. She struggled to keep her eyes open as the room began to spin. In a final act of desperation, she closed her eyes, trying to block out the figure's approach. The cold, and the oppressive weight bearing down on her. And then silence. When Julia opened her eyes again, she was lying on the floor, bathed in the soft glow of morning light. The figure was gone, and the door stood slightly ajar, as it had been when she first entered. Her body ached, and her mind was foggy, but she was alive. Shakily, she stood and stumbled out of the room, the cold sweat still clinging to her skin. She found the nearest nurse, stammering her way through the story, but when they returned to room 204, it was just as ordinary as ever. No sign of the cold. No sign of the figure. Julia never returned to the West Wing after that night, though she tried to convince herself it was all a hallucination, or a bad dream. Deep down, she knew the truth. Something evil lingered in room 204, waiting for its next visitor.